You want to know what we're all here for? Well, you better get hip to Podcast by George. Podcast by George. Podcast by George. He knows what he's fighting for. It's Podcast by George. Podcast by George. Want to know what we're fighting for?
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Well, the news just keeps getting bigger, and in a lot of ways, it is getting more grim. You know, I've had a lot of coverage on about the climate and that UN report that came out, which will scare the bejabbers out of anybody that's got a modicum of intellect. And I think our viewers do, and I think people are concerned about that. But again, the big news coming out, again, it's very grim, is out of Afghanistan. And, you know, it isn't like we didn't see this coming. It isn't like I didn't predict it and report on it. I did. I've been talking about Afghanistan since I started this podcast, basically, and those Afghan papers, even the candidacy of Tulsi Gabbard pointing out the lives and treasure lost by the United States over there pursuing a policy that nobody could exactly figure out. And, of course, Matthew Ho has been a frequent guest on Podcast by George, and he's one of the world's foremost authorities on Afghanistan, and he is coming back on, by the way, as soon as he can get free, because he's doing a lot of interviews, because that is his area of expertise. But the other expert that we've had on that's talked a lot about Afghanistan, and particularly how it intertwines with American politics, is Dr. Steffen W. Schmidt. Now, he is the professor emeritus of political science from Iowa State University. He's known as Dr. Politics throughout the state of Iowa and around the world, really. And we're going to be visiting with him today about Afghanistan. And here's what I would say about this situation, other than the fact that it was predicted. I mean, I'm not patting myself on the back here, but, you know, if you remember the PBG here a couple of months ago, or maybe even longer, I was showing images of Vietnam and the helicopters at the embassy getting people out of there. And Joe Biden himself, just as recently as a week ago, said, well, that's not going to happen in Afghanistan. Well, guess what? They had helicopters flying over the embassy in Kabul, getting people out of there. It was very strikingly similar. And like I said, we kind of knew it was coming. It's complicated, and it ain't Hollywood, folks. War never is. It's complex in a lot of respects, but it's kind of simple in other regards. I tell folks that the U.S. military and the war machine, when it goes and fights against guerrillas in a home country like this and kills civilians, that doesn't work, and it's not working there as well. Well, let's bring him on in. I've talked long enough, folks. It's time to say hello to our good friend of the PBG, Doc Politics. Doc, welcome on in.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, and even though these are not very happy times, I want to bring this up on screen. I want to show this to kind of illustrate what I was talking about very quickly. This is a chart that shows what has happened in Afghanistan. Thousands of civilians in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which I didn't connect it to directly, but there is a connection there from 2001 to 21. The U.S. troops, about 4,000 of them, 3,500 or so. Military and police, 75,000. Civilians, 78,000. That's always the toll in these things. Opposition fighters, including the Taliban, which, I don't know, you can make an argument those are civilians. They are fighters over there. 85,000 lives lost to that account. And, Doc, I know, you know, you're like me. You've seen this movie before, most notably in Vietnam. I mean, I think the breathtaking speed that the Taliban is reclaiming Afghanistan has everybody surprised, but the fact that it's happening is no shock.
It's no shock, and everything you said, you know, we could have been talking about this exactly like this a few months ago, and I think we did.
Yes.
You know, the whole myth that the United States had prepared a huge number of police and military in Afghanistan who were going to fight for their country, stabilize it, was a myth all along. And Biden knew it, Trump knew it, you know, Clinton knew it, Bush knew it, they all knew it, because those troops controlled primarily large cities like Kabul and a few others. They controlled some air bases, Kandahar and other places. But out in the mountains and rural areas of Afghanistan, the Taliban and the warlords were in control. It wasn't the government. And the government that was there, they always say a pro-American government, but it was also a pro-corruption government. I saw somebody saying just a couple of days ago, the biggest export from Afghanistan was wooden pallets filled in $100 bills being exported to their bank accounts in Middle Eastern countries. The troops in Afghanistan did not trust the government, and you cannot expect them to die for a government that they don't trust and that is corrupt, and that was not, in the end, supplying the Afghan troops, even with ammunition, food, and other supplies. They were out there. The Taliban, were in the communities, and you can't expect those soldiers to fight. So, they just surrendered, gave up, gave their arms to the Taliban, and anyone who didn't predict that should be fired.
That's exactly right. They need to be held accountable. And, no less than the Venerable Medea Benjamin was coming out and saying, again, this proves that we were right. You were wrong. And I look at it and say, them hippies was right, left, actually, and you guys were wrong. And they were wrong right down the line. The Afghan papers said we didn't know what we were doing, and this proves exactly that. And we have this projection thing. We want to infer these beliefs, and a lot of this has come from Hollywood and media folks, but we want to impose these upon other cultures and societies. We thought that those people over there would do a John Wayne, that they would fight to the last man to defend their country, that they would come out and oppose the Taliban. That's not what they do. I mean, that's not reality. I don't know if it's reality for us, but it's sure as hell not reality for them. What they do is they go negotiate with the golden rule, basically, like the doc says. Those warlords, they go and make peace internally and try to survive and thrive within their own country, and that's exactly what they're doing. But here's another thing I wanted to bring up, too. Now, this is from Matt Taibbi, that's been on my show before. I know the doc knows who this is. Now, he's a lefty, obviously, a left correspondent. He says, Afghanistan, we never learn. As the Taliban waltzes into Kabul, the look of surprise on the faces of top officials should frighten most of us. It says Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, when asked months ago about the possibility that there might be a significant deterioration of the security picture in Afghanistan once the United States withdrew its forces, said, I don't think it's going to be something that happens from a Friday to a Monday. My God, that's exactly what happened. It was from a Friday to a Monday. Blinken's Nostradamus moment was somehow one up by that of his boss, Joe Biden, who on July 8th had the following exchange with the press. Question, your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse. Biden, that is not true. They did not reach that conclusion. There is going to be no circumstance where you see people lifted off the roof of an embassy. The likelihood that you're going to see the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely. Folks, that's the President of the United States, my God, a month and a half ago. Down to their own stunningly, perfectly inaccurate mispredictions of what would take place, our military forces left the country. Biden administration officials could not have scripted a worse ending to the 20-year disaster that has been our occupation of Afghanistan. Here he shows an image of U.S. military dogs in Kabul evacuating from the city's airport, among other officials, as Taliban takes control of Afghanistan. The reason that is such a striking image is because they were shooting guns off in the air to prevent people from running out. And this is only 16 seconds long. Look at this. Okay, so those are the Afghan refugees wanting to get out of there. And we've got that image seared in our minds, the doc and I, of the U.S. forces leaving Vietnam with the helicopters. And Jerry Berry, the U.S. Marine pilot that has been on Podcast by George, talked about that. I hope folks got that podcast, because he ferried the last people out of there, including the U.S. ambassador in Vietnam. Well, that image will never go away. This image that you just saw, that will never go away. And folks, those people that were killed over there and their relatives and those people that we are leaving behind that you see in that video, their grandchildren, their great grandchildren will hate our guts and livers forever. They will be hunting us long after the Doc and I are gone. So that's my soapbox, Doc. I mean, this is a disaster now, and it's a disaster for the future.
Well, it is, and some people are saying, but look at the Vietnamese that went through so much during the war. They're now our friends. We're doing business there. American companies are establishing their bases in Vietnam, and you know, we love the Vietnamese. They love us, and you know, no hard feelings. I think this is different. I think the Taliban and the Iraqi and Iranians and Afghan Muslims, you know, have a religious faith, which the Vietnamese were secular. They could sort of forgive and forget. I don't think these folks can. One thing I want to say is I did another show, good show, not as good as yours, but pretty good, where they had a bunch of experts, and one of them said, well, you know, it's all a bunch of white men that got us into this and so on. And I said, wait a minute, Hillary Clinton, progressive Democrats, somewhat progressive feminists and others are also responsible for us going in and staying in Afghanistan to make it possible for girls and women to get an education. Let's never forget that. This was a bipartisan mistake for different reasons. You know, the Republicans, conservatives, and others were in there for other national security reasons, maybe regional control, maybe, you know, protection of oil interests or whatever. But I think liberals and progressives need to remember that they also said, you know, and they were still saying, we can't abandon the women and the girls, you know, that we helped get an education. They showed pictures of girls walking to school still yesterday. Well, you know, if the Afghans don't want girls and women to have an education, it's a pretty far reach for us to be there to make that happen if they can't make it happen themselves. It's complex.
It is. That's what I started off by saying. It is complex. Here's what Matthew Ho would say. He's the guy that resigned his State Department post, I think back in 2009, because of the way the U.S. was approaching this. And this is the problem with the moderates that you talked about, and even this women's issue. The Taliban in 2009, they were kind of getting their asses handed to them, and they wanted to negotiate. They wanted to talk about peace, but the United States was ramping up. Matthew Ho was watching this. They were going to have 250,000 soldiers in Afghanistan, and they said, no, we're not negotiating anything with you. You're not going to get a negotiated settlement from us. We're going to win this thing with these 250,000 troops in this surge. We're going to win it militarily. Well, since then, the bombs have fallen. The war has gone off. These civilians have died, including a lot of women and girls, folks, since 2009 have died on the soil of Afghanistan. It could have been prevented if we had made the decision to diplomatically end it back then. Never should have gone in to begin with, but end it in 2009, not continue it militarily, which is what we did. And then when you lose militarily, which we just did, what happens? We're seeing it unfold.
Yeah, this is the the lesson not learned. I mean, as you said, you know, the most sophisticated military equipment and strategic thinking and complex bases and satellite surveillance and drones and everything else, unfortunately, or reality speaks, is no match for people who live there, whose grandparents and great-grandparents are buried down the road from where this is happening. They're going to fight for that. And, you know, it would be the same in the U.S. I mean, if a very powerful country were to try to take us over, you know, all of you people would go out into the woods and you'd get out your guns and live off the land, and you wouldn't allow it to happen. And so, you know, for us to not understand that is hubris. I grew up in Colombia. South America, where there has been a civil war going on for 30 or 40 years. And the Colombian government is well trained. They have great military forces. They have the US support. They have American equipment. They haven't been able to put an end to the FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, who are, still controlling a large part of rural Colombia after all these years. So negotiating peace, trying to somehow get along with each other is a better strategy. Although most people would say, well, the Taliban, they're not going to live up to their promises. You're going to make a deal with them. They promise to not do this or to do that, and you can't trust them. So there's no trust there either. They probably don't trust us. And it's the sad reality of human behavior and nationhood and nationalism and religion. Sad stuff.
It's a fact. I mean, I thank God I never had to fight in a war or be in the military, but it's just like a street fight almost. I mean, people want you to fight fair. Well, if I wanted to fight fair, I wouldn't be trying to break your nose. That's the way that I always put it to people. There is no such thing as a fair fight. Same thing with these wars and the resolution of them and the peacemaking. We want these people to honor their word. Their word. How you're trying to blow them up. I mean, they know that. This is a life and death thing. This isn't a John Wayne scenario where you honor your word with somebody that's trying to kill you. And the covering your asses thing is beginning now in earnest, and you're going to see and hear a lot of that. These politicians, Republican and Democrat folks, are responsible for this right down the line. I want to underline the fact that Joe Biden is wanting to tell people that he opposed the invasion of Afghanistan. He did not. He voted for that authorization that George Bush used to take us in there. He says that he was opposed to the surge. He was not. In 2009, Biden proposed sending 20,000 more troops on top of the 40,000 more that Obama had already sent. Obama sent 30,000 for 100,000 total. So what Biden did was he proposed a smaller surge on top of a surge. I mean, it's parsing of the words. It's covering your ass. This is a disaster, and everybody in Washington, D.C. is responsible for it from the top right on down. And maybe we could say we as citizens are also responsible for allowing them to do it. It's just horrible, tragic.
And the mainstream media, has not been reporting accurately the fact that we have been losing this war for years.
Yes.
And my friends and my alumni who are in the military still try to tell me we could have won this war if it hadn't been for the civilians. We put in as much as you could put in. Billions of dollars, assistance, nation building, trying to build schools. I remember we built some schools, I think it was in Iraq, for kids out in the countryside. And as we withdrew from the country, I think this, people went back to see how those schools were doing, and the locals had used them as barns for their goats. They weren't being used as schools. They needed a barn, not a school. And for us not to understand that, is just a tragedy. And so we're going to be talking about this for a while. Meanwhile, there's all this other stuff. The climate report that you mentioned.
Oh, my God.
It's forgotten. It's forgotten in the midst of all this. And then the COVID surge and the fact that in a lot of states, the governors are preventing schools and others from wearing masks and they're not pushing vaccinations hard enough. Iowa is now reaching the point, maybe it's already happened, where we're throwing away huge numbers of vaccines because nobody wants them and because we were not kind enough to give them to places where they don't have vaccines, which I think if you believe in God, you're going to be punished for not helping out people in other places. You're going to be punished by God, because that would have been a wonderful humanitarian kind thing. If Iowans don't want vaccines and we have too many of them, well, that's our problem, But don't let those vaccines go to waste. I found that to be a horrible story, and the politicians in Iowa, shame on you.
It's a house of mirrors. We are stumbling around in a house of mirrors. We're out of time with the doc, but I wanted to cover this story very quickly because this is something that he is uniquely qualified to comment on, because we think of him as Dr. Politics and we think of him as the Iowa guy. And to be real truthful with you, the rest of the world does too, because they always want to talk to him about Iowa. But he's also an authority and an expert when it comes to the state of New Hampshire. He spends a lot of time there. He's on the ground in New Hampshire.
Right.
He has a unique understanding of their politics. Well, look at this. Let me bring this up on screen. Okay, this is headline: former Iowa Democratic Chair Troy Price. Remember that guy? He was just named the New Hampshire Democratic Party Executive Director. Price resigned as IDP chair after the 2020 caucus controversy here in Iowa. But they say there in New Hampshire, he has full confidence of NHDP officials. And just read the first paragraph or two of this. The New Hampshire Democratic Party has tapped the former chair of the Iowa Democrats as its top staffer for the 2022 midterm elections and the 2024 presidential cycle as well. Honest to God, I got to take this. It makes me laugh. I mean, this is just... unbelievable, Doc. This guy took the fall, basically, took ownership of his own volition of the biggest debacle maybe in American politics, but certainly in Democratic politics in the state of Iowa. And he just got hired to the top post in New Hampshire. What's going on?
Well, I have talked with lots of people. I know a lot of people in New Hampshire and a lot of people in politics and some Democrats. And they are surprised because the optics of it isn't great. You know, you hire the person who basically may have destroyed the first in the nation political caucuses, not by his fault, but in a sense because he was running an organization that was wonky and dysfunctional, and that was undermined by the National Democratic Party with a terrible app that didn't work and so on. And some of them have told me, well, he's really a pretty smart political manager and he can manage an organization. So that's why we hired him. But a lot of them are establishment Democrats who felt sorry for him for them having essentially embarrassed him so much. And somebody said, well, we don't have anybody in New Hampshire who could run the Democratic Party of New Hampshire. And others have said that's ridiculous. You know, New Hampshire is a state that has a huge amount of political experience with their first in the nation primary, and there are lots of New Hampshireites who could have done this job. So it's another one of those things. It's like, really?
Well, okay. Let me give you the conspiracy theory on this, which I hold, and you can reel me in and tell me how this isn't accurate. But I look at that and say that when it came to the caucus for Iowa in 2020, there was one thing that the DNC was not going to allow happen, and that was Bernie Sanders winning the thing. They'd had the experience in 2016. There was some funny baloney stuff going on behind the scenes there, revealed by WikiLeaks. They couldn't do that again. So they came up with a fail-safe, and the fail-safe was this app, this shadow app, and they created that. And what happened was, now this is a conspiracy, but when it looked like Bernie was going to win or was going to be close enough that he could be considered the winner, that thing malfunctioned. Quote unquote. Maybe it operated exactly like it was intended to. It obscured the results. It allowed Pete Buttigieg, deeply entrenched in the DNC, kind of the Clinton's choice, who a lot of people say own the DNC, to come away as the winner of the Iowa caucus. Troy Price, the chair of the Iowa Democratic Party, takes the fall and is unemployed, and then all of a sudden pops up being rewarded in New Hampshire. Doc, is that just a conspiracy theory, or do you think there's any reality to that?
I love conspiracy theories, and let's all think about this one. It's a good one, George. It's a very good one. As conspiracies go, we always worried that the Iowa Democratic Party, even before Price, when it was run by a doctor, a woman who was a Hillary Clinton supporter, was essentially leaning in favor of certain candidates. In that case, it was Hillary Clinton. Then
Sure.
later, it was to get away from Bernie Sanders, and they didn't have their own favorite candidate, so they went with just killing off Bernie Sanders. But the point is that it's a strange situation when you hire someone who crashed an airplane and make him the next pilot of your plane.
That's exactly right. And we need to look at that flight data recorder, folks. I'm telling you, the cockpit voice recorder needs to be examined. Doc, we're out of time. It's always a pleasure visiting with you. We haven't had you on for a while yet. Politics, of course. I don't know if we're going to get any of this behind us, so particularly the climate. My God, I mean, the politics, we need to be talking climate. We're going to do that a lot. And I know that you've spent a goodly part of your career involved in this climate issue. So we'll be circling back with you here very shortly.
All right.
All right, Doc. Thanks again for coming on the podcast by George.
Thank you.
Folks, if you enjoyed Dr. Steffen W. Schmidt, the guy that wrote this book here, American Government and Politics Today, Professor Emeritus from Iowa State University, the world authority on Iowa politics, certainly New Hampshire also, and American politics. Please watch Podcast by George on YouTube. You can see us on Facebook. Listen to the audio portion of the podcast on iTunes and Spotify. Those are a couple of popular platforms, the iHeartRadio app, places like that. And you'll get each and every episode if you subscribe. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.